1869 was a year like no other when it came to the railway industry in the United States. 35 or so years earlier, there had barely been a railway line of any kind in America. The railway mania had arrived from Britain in the 1840s, and when the American West opened up in the 1850s, after the US had acquired territory all the way to California at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, plans were soon emerging for how to connect the country with the revolutionary new mode of travel. It took time, and it would be the 1880s before the East Coast was connected to the West Coast via rail. A major step in that was achieved in 1869. Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who had become fabulously rich from his role in the steamship revolution decades earlier, before diversifying into rail, acquired a controlling interest in the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway that year. When combined with his virtual monopoly over the railways in New York, along the Hudson River, and in the tri-state area, this meant he was effectively in charge of the railway industry all the way from Manhattan to the edge of the Great Plains. That same year, 1869, he ordered work to commence on Grand Central Depot in Manhattan as a dominant rail station in New York. The Vanderbilts would continue to acquire more and more control over the railways as thousands of kilometers of new lines were laid down in the 1870s and 1880s. The family became immensely rich in the process. If you were one of the millions of migrants who arrived at New York in the late 19th or early 20th centuries from Europe and decided to travel on further west, chances were you did so on a railway line operated by the Vanderbilts. And yet, within a few generations, the influence and riches of this powerful American dynasty had started to vanish. This is the story of the rapid rise and fall of the Vanderbilt dynasty. The Vanderbilts owed their rise to riches and fame in the 19th century to one man, Cornelius Vanderbilt. What is most striking about the family prior to this is how little we know about them. A few things are quite clear. As the name suggests, the family are Dutch-American. Back in the 1610s, when the English had already established a colony in North America at Jamestown in Virginia, and the French were setting up their first trading stations along the St. Lawrence River in what is now Canada, a number of Dutch explorers were exploring the east coast of North America. In 1624, the first Dutch settlers arrived at the mouth of the Hudson River and began setting up a colony that they termed New Netherland. The main settlement was a place which they called New Amsterdam, at the southern end of an island which the local Lenape natives called Manhattan. The Dutch colony prospered here over the next 40 years. In around 1661, a Dutch settler by the name of Jan Aertsen arrived at the colony. He came from a village called Bilt near Utrecht in the Dutch Republic. He was a poor laborer who arrived in New Amsterdam with virtually nothing. His wife was a woman named Annetje. They had a son, Aris Janse, in 1653, who later used the name Vanderbilt as 3 words to indicate his father's origin in Bilt, back in the Netherlands. Over time, this became the family surname and was simplified as one word, Vanderbilt. We know that Jan arrived at New Amsterdam around 1661, as he swore an oath of allegiance to the English crown in 1687, in which he stated that he had first come to the colony 26 years earlier. He and his family lived in a place called Breukelen, a Dutch place name which basically means marshland. Later, it was anglicized as Brooklyn. His arrival there was in the midst of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Between 1652 and 1674, England and the Dutch Republic fought 3 wars as they vied for control of the shipping routes around the North Sea and also for control of the east coast of what is now the United States. In 1665, the Second Anglo-Dutch War was triggered by the English seizure of New Amsterdam the previous year. They renamed it New York, and although the Dutch briefly retook the colony in the mid-1670s during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, when these conflicts ended, England was acknowledged as being in charge of the colony of New York. Hence, Dutch settlers like Jan Aertsen and his family ended up living under English rule. The town at the bottom tip of Manhattan and the surrounding settlements in places like Brooklyn prospered in the century that followed, although New York was not the foremost city of the 13 colonies of England at the time. Philadelphia and Boston were more substantial urban centers, and when the Founding Fathers met to form the Second Continental Congress in May 1775, they did so in Philadelphia. That being said, New York, because of its natural harbors and the trade in furs and other commodities which was conducted up the Hudson River, did develop as a leading center of trade and commerce. There were no bridges in those days between Manhattan and the surrounding regions like Brooklyn on the other side of the Hudson River or New Jersey. Anyone who wanted to go from Manhattan to Brooklyn or vice versa did so by a small boat or ferry. This would later impact on the rise of the Vanderbilts. It is surprising how few records there are about the descendants of Jan Aertsen in New York in the 18th century. He lived to be an old man and died there in 1705. This means he had lived long enough to see his grandson, Jacob Aertsen Vanderbilt, grow to be 13 years of age. Jacob, born in 1692, had moved with his family to Staten Island by the start of the 1730s. This branch of the Vanderbilts was the one into which Cornelius Vanderbilt would be born. Jacob Vanderbilt had a son named Jacob as well, who married a woman named Mary Sprague in 1746 on Staten Island. She was of English heritage. They had a son who they named Cornelius, and who was consequently half Dutch and half English. In turn, this Cornelius Vanderbilt married another woman of English ancestry, Phoebe Hand. It was this couple which, on the 27th of May 1794, welcomed a son who they named Cornelius Vanderbilt after his father. This was the man who would launch the Vanderbilts to riches and fame and become known as the Commodore, on account of his dominance of shipping around the New York area. By the time he was born, the Vanderbilt name had gradually morphed from 3 words to 2, Vander and Bilt, and then finally to the more simple Vanderbilt, all as one word. Because of his grandfather and father's marriages, although Cornelius bore a Dutch surname, he was actually only 1/4 Dutch. Fortunes are created during times of change. A peasant could not become immensely wealthy living in a small medieval agricultural community because without innovation, rapid social and technological change, and large lines of credit and money, there is no way of accumulating huge amounts of wealth. It is only in societies that are changing rapidly and growing that people can go from being poor or barely getting by to being very rich. The United States in the 19th century was an ideal society in which to become rich. When the first federal census was undertaken in 1790, there were under 4 million people in the country, which was largely confined to the East Coast at that time. By 1850, there were over 23 million people, and the government had acquired lands running all the way west to the Pacific Ocean. By 1900, around 76 million people lived in the United States. This sheer population growth, combined with a boom in commodities like cotton, along with gold, silver, and oil rushes, grew America's wealth. Most importantly, the country had begun to industrialize. When that first federal census was taken in 1790, the Industrial Revolution was still largely confined to England. It was only in the 19th century that countries like France, Germany, and the US began to adopt industrial techniques. New York and Pennsylvania were early centers of coal mining, iron smelting, and basic industrial processes, while the construction of the Erie Canal to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie provided riverine transport all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Steam power was widely adopted, and soon this was being used not only to power the new industrial factories, but to move ships rather than relying on wind power. It was this latter innovation that would make Cornelius Vanderbilt his first fortune. Cornelius Vanderbilt began his working life as a boat operator. This doesn't sound particularly glamorous, and indeed it wasn't to begin with. He only went to school for a few years as a child, and by the time he was 12, he was working with his father operating a ferry that transported people around New York Harbor between places like Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. It was possible for some in those days to rise from nothing to something with hard work and diligence. Cornelius saved his money, borrowed a little bit more, and when he was just 16 years old, he purchased a small boat of his own. By the end of the 1810s, when he was only in his mid-20s, he was living in Manhattan and had a growing business operating both passenger ferries and cargo ships that transported goods between Manhattan and places like New Jersey. Vanderbilt was an early adopter of steamships. He faced competition from the Hudson River Steamboat Association, which had a quasi-monopoly on steamboat shipping on the Hudson River, and they paid him a large bribe to stay away from their sphere of control and concentrate instead on the shipping routes along Long Island Sound. By 1838, he had control over the Staten Island ferry, the kind of unglamorous business that makes a person wealthy only over time, as ships went over and back between Staten Island and Manhattan, each voyage putting money in Vanderbilt's pocket. With his capital, he branched out into other endeavors. He bought up real estate in Manhattan and other places in New York and New Jersey, had a stake in the booming textiles trade, and by the early 1840s had a growing interest in the railway industry around New York. By then, he had become known to all on the East Coast as the Commodore, the name for a senior naval officer. This was in recognition of his dominance of the shipping routes around New York and New Jersey by that time. By the end of the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt had become a wealthy man from his shipping and ferrying business. The country itself was changing too, and this offered new opportunities. In 1846, the US had gone to war with Mexico. After inflicting a devastating defeat on their southern neighbor and capturing Mexico City, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was agreed in 1848. This ceded lands running from New Mexico all the way west to California and Oregon. In an incredibly fortuitous bit of timing, a large vein of gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill in California just 9 days before the treaty was signed. Soon, hundreds of thousands of people would be making their way to the West Coast to join the California Gold Rush. Contrary to the popular view of people riding out west on horses and wagons, a majority of the 49ers, as the gold prospectors who flocked out west in the late 1840s and early 1850s became known as, actually traveled to California by ship. A substantial proportion went south all the way to Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, and then all the way back north to California. Others went as far south as Central America, and then made the short passage across the Isthmus of Panama before sailing north. Vanderbilt decided to capitalize on the latter movement of people and formed the Accessory Transit Company in 1850. The company offered passage from New York to around Nicaragua in Central America, then transport by stagecoach across Central America before boarding another ship on the Pacific coast to head north to San Francisco. The company ran into difficulties a few years later after an American by the name of William Walker temporarily seized control of Nicaragua and nationalized the Accessory Transit Company. What the whole endeavor reveals, though, was that Vanderbilt was immediately alive to the possible profits to be made from transporting people westwards as rushes like the California Gold Rush began in the second half of the 19th century. It illustrates the way his brain swiftly recognized new business opportunities. The California Gold Rush and the land seizures following the Mexican-American War signaled the opening of the American West. With hundreds of thousands of European migrants arriving to the cities of the East Coast every year and an endless thirst for more land and riches, people began spreading out to the West Coast, the Great Plains, the Rockies, and even the desert-like regions of New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. This process happened to coincide with the expansion of the railway network in the country. The first railway lines had been laid down in Massachusetts and other states at the end of the 1820s. It was only in the 1840s that a real boom in railway construction began in America. Accordingly, when the American West opened up from 1848 onwards, shrewd businessmen quickly realized that the project of the next quarter of a century or more would be to connect the country with tens of thousands of kilometers of railway lines. There were plans in place already by the 1850s for the construction of lines all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the US government even purchased a strip of land in what is now southern Arizona from the Mexican government in 1854, known as the Gadsden Purchase, with the intention of running a southern rail line from Texas to California through here. It would not be completed until the early 1880s. Vanderbilt was one of the first individuals to fully see the future of transport and communications in the United States as the country changed around mid-century. Thus, in the 1850s, he began diversifying his business interests, moving away from shipping and into the railway business. It was really in the 1860s that Vanderbilt's railway business interests exploded. In the 1850s, he had become a party in the financing and management of the Erie Railway, which ran from New Jersey to Lake Erie, as well as a route between New Haven and Hartford in Connecticut. The busiest line of all was an intercity train running from Lower Manhattan around the business district all the way north to Harlem. In the mid-1860s, Vanderbilt aggressively expanded to take a controlling interest in these lines and to also buy up a range of other railways in the wider region running from Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey west to the Great Lakes. He was also building new lines to establish an entire network of railways which he had a controlling stake in all around the northeast of the United States. To finance these, he began selling large amounts of his shipping businesses. Vanderbilt had seen that his older ships were soon going to be made obsolete by new, enormous passenger steamships that were being built in the United Kingdom in ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Belfast. Instead of trying to stay relevant in the shipping industry, he diversified swiftly to become the foremost railway magnate in the United States. As we have seen, by the end of the 1860s, he was expanding his network of lines west as far as Michigan and was building elaborate train stations in New York and elsewhere to act as transit nodes for the lines. He did have rivals, notably Jay Gould, a deeply unpopular individual who Vanderbilt ended up in a lengthy conflict with, which led both men to engage in market manipulation at various times. Vanderbilt's business presence in America by the 1860s was such that his stance on the slavery issue and the American Civil War that broke out after the Confederate attack at Fort Sumter on the 12th of April 1861 was a matter of public interest. As a northern businessman whose businesses lay entirely apart from the southern economic activity that was based around slavery, Vanderbilt was a supporter of the Union cause. At the same time, Vanderbilt was a tough figure, a man who didn't fully trust anyone and always placed his business interests above those of country or cause. Therefore, the support he offered the Union cause was always partially conditional. On the 17th of March 1862, he met President Abraham Lincoln and the Secretary of War Edward Stanton in the White House. At the time, the war at sea, which was very underdeveloped by comparison with the war on land, was at a delicate point. The Confederates had begun building ironclad warships like the Virginia, which were devastating when they encountered wooden Union warships. Lincoln and Stanton wanted the Commodore's help to fight the war at sea. He duly obliged and handed over his ship, the Vanderbilt, now fitted with steel plating for defense to the Union. It was a huge ship that had reportedly cost $1 million to build, so this was quite an expense for Vanderbilt. For this and other acts, Vanderbilt won a lot of praise for aiding the Union war effort and was awarded a Congressional Gold Medal in 1864. Yet Vanderbilt wasn't being entirely selfless here. As a monopolist, who sometimes ended up in conflict with the government over his business dealings, aiding in the war effort earned him the kind of government favor that was priceless in the years after the war. The conflict cost him on an emotional level. His favorite son, George Washington Vanderbilt, contracted tuberculosis during the war, from which he soon died. Vanderbilt might have engaged in philanthropic activity and been a keen supporter of the Civil War cause, yet there were many criticisms of his conduct as well. A common theme was that the Commodore paid little tax and had used government funding to accrue a large slice of his wealth. The issue was described succinctly in an article in The Atlantic, published a few years after he died. Here it was stated that, quote, "The railroads owe on stocks and bonds $4,600,000,000, more than twice our national debt of $2,220,000,000, and tax the people annually $490 million, 1.5 times more than the government's revenue last year of $274 million. More than any other class, our railroad men have developed the country and tried its institutions. The evasion of almost all taxes by the New York Central Railroad has thrown upon the people of New York State more than a fair share of the cost of government, and illustrates some of the methods by which the rich are making the poor poorer." Indeed, Vanderbilt's final years were lived under a cloud of condemnation. The period from 1873 to 1879 is known as the Long Depression in the economic history of Europe and the Americas. The social unrest caused by it peaked in 1877, when the Great Railroad Strike took place between mid-July and early September, involving over 100,000 railway workers all along the East Coast and further west towards Chicago, Cleveland, and St. Louis. The Commodore was already dead for a few months when the Great Railroad Strike began, but there is no doubting that he was partly responsible for it. The primary grievance of the strikers was that they were being asked to take a third pay cut within the space of a year, even as Vanderbilt had died as reputedly the wealthiest man in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch of the dynasty, who rose from almost nothing, working on the ferries of the Hudson River when he was just a child, to become the railway tycoon of America and reputedly the country's wealthiest man, died on the 4th of January 1877 at 82 years of age. Unlike later generations of the family, he had taken the decision to bequeath the bulk of his fortune and business empire to a primary heir. This was his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. Billy, as the family knew him, was born in 1821, when his father was just starting to establish himself as a major player in the shipping industry on the East Coast. The Commodore was a domineering father who had insisted on training William as his successor in a very set way. After his schooling was finished, he was brought in to work as a clerk to learn the business from the ground up in the office, when the primary Vanderbilt activity was still boats and ferries. He had a difficult relationship with his father, who belittled him and questioned both his intelligence and his suitability to succeed him one day. That situation changed over time, as Billy gradually earned the Commodore's trust and demonstrated his competence. By the early 1860s, Cornelius had started appointing him to more senior positions, running several of the railway lines which the family had control over. In an age when people rarely lived into their 80s, the Commodore would have expected that William would succeed him before long. In the end, because he lived to 82 years, Billy was 55 years old already when he took over the family business. He acquired an estimated 95% of his father's wealth and empire. The rest was split up between his siblings. They might have felt hard done by, but the amount of money involved meant that none of them would want for anything anyway. When he succeeded his father at the start of 1877, Billy Vanderbilt inherited around $100 million worth of money and business assets. This was the first time that he could be said to be unquestionably in charge of the business empire, although he had gradually been taking over from his father throughout the 1870s as the Commodore aged and his health declined. William's first year in sole charge of the business was difficult, as he navigated the issue of the Great Railroad Strike. It was the first of numerous public relations disasters which he had to grapple with. Subsequent issues would later arise about an interview which he gave to a journalist where he was quoted out of context in the Chicago Daily News to make it sound as though he had said he didn't care about the public when it came to making money from the railways. This happened in 1883. A year later, he ended up mired in a controversy surrounding a Ponzi scheme which the former President of the United States and Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant had also been unsuspectingly drawn into. Despite these issues, Billy presided over a period of unprecedented prosperity for the Vanderbilt railway businesses in the late 1870s and into the 1880s, as America left the long depression and a new era of economic growth began. Nonetheless, he should not be viewed as a man possessed with the kind of business acumen that his father had possessed. William inherited a vast railway empire at a time when people were traveling more and more around the United States, and hundreds of thousands of Europeans were arriving into the country each year, many of whom traveled onwards by train once they arrived at the port cities by boat. He followed the blueprint the Commodore had set out, growing the railway business, continuing to monopolize the routes from New York west to the Great Lakes and in the Northeast, and letting the money flow in. By the time he died, quite suddenly, from a stroke at 64 years of age, on the 8th of December 1885, it is estimated that Billy Vanderbilt had expanded the family wealth to nearly twice what it had been when he took over from his father 9 years earlier. Like his father, Billy Vanderbilt had a large family, 9 children in all, 5 boys and 4 girls. Where he did not mirror his father was in how he divided up his vast business empire and fortune. Cornelius had passed the vast majority of his estate to Billy, almost as though it was a royal succession. Billy decided to divide it up more evenly. Nevertheless, there were primary heirs, as was revealed when his last will and testament was published in 1886, the year after his death. Such was the interest in the financial and familial affairs of the Vanderbilts in America at the time. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the nature of the time, Billy's 4 surviving sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, William Kissam, Frederick, and George Washington, did the best, and they were appointed executors of the will, along with Billy's widow, Maria Louisa. The girls were given significant properties and assets, but less than the boys, and they were not made executrixes. Even amongst the sons there was a hierarchy. The important passage states, "All the rest, residue and remainder of all the property and estate, real, personal, and mixed, of every description, and wheresoever situated, of which I may be seized or possessed, or to which I may be entitled at the time of my death, I give, demise, and bequeath unto my 2 sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt and William K. Vanderbilt, in equal shares, and to their heirs and assigns to their own use forever." Thus, Billy opted to make William Kissam and Cornelius Vanderbilt II, his 2 eldest surviving sons, his main heirs, though his other children did very well too. As the eldest son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II took over as president and chairman of the main companies within the Vanderbilt Empire after their father died somewhat unexpectedly in December 1885. Cornelius received around $70 million worth of the family empire. He was in charge for the next 14 years. Cornelius II was a competent manager who had been his grandfather, the Commodore's favorite grandson, in part because he was simply older than many of his siblings and cousins, and was well into his 30s before the elder Cornelius died. The patriarch of the family also liked his grandson and namesake's work ethic, and the Vanderbilt companies continued to prosper and to rake in money under Cornelius II's oversight. There was a problem at the same time. The younger Cornelius failed to innovate, which was an issue during a period when companies were being formed throughout North America and Europe to produce the first automobiles. Once this mode of transport was made affordable, it would reduce the massive reliance of people on trains to get around their state or from city to city. In failing to realize this and adapt in the way that the Commodore surely would have, his grandson sowed the seeds of future decline. Cornelius II's interests ultimately lay elsewhere. As we will see, he was a notable philanthropist and also built many great townhouses and country estates in New York and elsewhere on the East Coast. Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered a stroke in 1896 when he was only 52 years of age. This necessitated him playing a reduced role in running the various railway companies and other businesses. Then he died 3 years later on the 12th of September 1899. When he did, his younger brother William Kissam Vanderbilt, the second major benefactor from their father's will, took over affairs. Like his brother, William Kissam was a competent, though not massively imaginative manager of the Vanderbilt Railway Empire. He had received around $55 million back in 1885 when their father died, slightly less than Cornelius. His real interest lay in horse racing. In the early 1880s, he had been the driving force behind the construction of the American Horse Exchange on Broadway in Manhattan, and he was a prominent backer of the development of the Sheep's Head Bay racetrack on Coney Island in New Jersey, of which he served as president for a time. Ultimately, his interest in horse racing became so great that it signaled the first time in which the Vanderbilts started to hand over the management of their business interests to people outside of the family. In 1903, he effectively handed over the day-to-day running of the railway companies to a board of hired managers, and then, after marrying his second wife, Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford, he moved to France. built an impressive chateau there, and devoted himself fully to horse racing. His horses went on to win a huge number of titles at important race meets in France between his relocation there and his death in 1920. By the time Cornelius II and William Kissam were in charge, the Vanderbilt business empire extended beyond the transport sector. Beyond investing in champion racehorses, they had stakes in some of the most important racetracks, like Pimlico Racecourse at Biltmore in Maryland. The family played a role in the mining and metallurgical sector and had a major stake in the Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting Company. The family also eventually moved into hospitality. In 1912, the Vanderbilt Hotel opened on Park Avenue in Manhattan and became an exclusive venue for New York high society in the 1920s. Indeed, anything associated with travel was an area in which the Vanderbilts had an interest. This included the Western Union Telegraph Company, which started out as a company for sending messages via telegraph, cutting-edge technology in the 19th century, and which later became a global leader in wiring money to travelers. The Vanderbilts were one of the major business dynasties of the Gilded Age in America, along with the likes of J.P. Morgan, that were early investors when General Electric formed in 1892 in association with Thomas Edison to drive the ongoing electrification of the United States. The black sheep of the family, who were partially disinherited for various reasons, Cornelius Vanderbilt III and his son Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, even branched out into developing the first stretches of New York's subway system, in Cornelius III's case, while his son became a newspaper proprietor. Thus, the Vanderbilt Empire, in one form or another, included hotels, horses, metallurgy, electrification, urban transport, the media, and telegraphy. Over time, the Vanderbilts became almost as well known for their elaborate houses as they did for their businesses. The most famous was the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house in Midtown Manhattan. This was built in 1883 by the Commodore's grandson across an entire block on the west side of Fifth Avenue between West 57th and West 58th Street. The enormous mansion was 6 stories high and also had a vast basement, gardens and stables. There were literally dozens of rooms in the mansion, along with everything from a smoking room to an art gallery. It is understood to have been the largest private residence ever built in Midtown Manhattan. Not far away, between 51st and 52nd Streets, the Vanderbilt Triple Mansion was erected in the early 1880s by Billy Vanderbilt. It was an equally grand building to that erected by his son a few streets away. However, this particular vast townhouse was divided in 3. A portion was used by William himself. The others became the Manhattan homes of his daughters, Emily and Margaret. The New York houses were eclipsed by the Biltmore Estate, which George Washington Vanderbilt II had built in North Carolina. This is a fine example of Gilded Age architecture and remains in the ownership of the Vanderbilt family to this day. Over 1,000 construction workers were employed to build it between 1889 and 1895. The Breakers Mansion at Newport on Rhode Island was built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II at the very same time that work on Biltmore was underway. This summer retreat is on the National Register of Historic Places today. Elm Court near Stockbridge, Massachusetts, was built under the direction of Emily Vanderbilt. It is the largest shingle-style house in the United States, an architectural style of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which attempted to revive the colonial architecture of New England. A dozen other Vanderbilt mansions, such as Hyde Park Mansion and the Marble House, could be noted as examples of outstanding Gilded Age architecture that are national monuments or registered historic places in the United States today. The Vanderbilts did not spend all of their vast wealth on themselves. This was a time in American history when the great business tycoons of the country believed in philanthropy and the use of their wealth to benefit society. Vanderbilt's contemporary, Andrew Carnegie, even wrote a book entitled The Gospel of Wealth, in which he outlined how wealth should be used for the betterment of the world. He founded Carnegie Hall. J.P. Morgan set up the Pierpont Morgan Library. Before either of these men patronized these establishments, the Commodore had provided $1 million, an enormous sum at the time, to endow the foundation of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, in Tennessee, in 1873. The location might seem peculiar, as the Vanderbilts had no real ties to Tennessee. Instead, Vanderbilt chose the location in the South as an educational institution which would help to heal the wounds of the Civil War in the southern states. 13 years after this, the Commodore's granddaughter, Emily Vanderbilt, who was married to William Sloan, donated a large sum of money towards establishing the Sloan Hospital for Women in the Washington Heights district of Manhattan. Numerous prominent cultural institutions on the East Coast benefited from the patronage of the Vanderbilts over the decades, notably the Vanderbilt Gallery at the American Fine Arts Society, while the Vanderbilt Museum was founded on Long Island. Then there were philanthropic initiatives that were more eclectic. In 1896, having recently completed work on the Biltmore Estate, George Washington Vanderbilt had Biltmore Forest School established on the estate, the first school dedicated exclusively to forestry in the United States. Finally, the original Madison Square Garden was first developed as a site for hosting sporting events in New York City by William Kissam Vanderbilt, although it was in a different part of Midtown Manhattan than the modern-day Madison Square Garden. This raises a simple question. Exactly how wealthy were the Vanderbilts? The grand townhouses and country estates that they built cost hundreds of millions of dollars alone in modern terms. So, how much money was there floating around by the time these houses were being constructed in the 1880s and 1890s? This is a difficult question to answer. Unlike today, or much of the 20th century, when there is a fascination with constantly cataloguing the wealth of the world's richest people and listing them in sequential order, there weren't really rich lists in the 19th century, nor were there even tax declarations of any kind that allow governments to see exactly how much money and assets a person had. Nevertheless, it's reasonably clear that the Commodore had around $100 million to his name when he died in 1877, which amounts to billions of dollars in modern terms. This was not the height of the family wealth, however. Because he left behind a virtual monopoly on the railways in the eastern United States at his death, and the railways were at their peak in the 30 years that followed, money continued to pour into the Vanderbilt family coffers. At the peak of the family's wealth around the 1890s, the Vanderbilts were almost certainly worth $100 billion in modern terms, and arguably twice that amount. The issue, though, was that the family wealth was being divided up and diluted. Cornelius and his wife Sophia had 13 children, 12 of whom lived to be adults. These, in turn, had large families. William Vanderbilt, his primary heir for instance, had 9 children. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had 7 children. It's not hard to see how the Vanderbilt family wealth was diluted when the Commodore had literally scores of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There is no better example of how the growth of the Vanderbilt dynasty in the generations after Cornelius's time diluted the family wealth than the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt. She was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, and so was a great-granddaughter of the Commodore. Consuelo was born in 1877 and went on to become one of what were somewhat derogatorily termed dollar princesses or dollar duchesses. These were the daughters of wealthy American businessmen who married into the British aristocracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a period in which many of the leading dukes and earls of Britain were mired in debt after generations of reckless gambling and expenditure. To dig their families out of debt, many of the dukes and earls in question married off their heirs to the daughters of wealthy Americans who brought a very large financial dowry with them that alleviated the economic crisis of the British aristocratic household in question. In Consuelo's case, she married Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and the custodian of Blenheim Palace, the finest aristocratic country house in all of England. When they were wed in 1895, Charles received $2.5 million worth of railway stock, the equivalent of about $100 million in today's money. The Vanderbilts acquired a position within the British aristocracy. The marriage saved Marlborough, a first cousin of Winston Churchill, from his financial distress, but it was an immensely unhappy union. By 1906, the Duke and Duchess had unofficially separated, and they formally divorced in 1921. Consuelo's mother, Alva, would later admit that she had forced Consuelo into the marriage. It was a striking example of how millions of dollars of the family fortune were squandered in pursuit of social status in this instance. If a person wants to get a sense of how the Vanderbilt family wealth declined so rapidly in the 20th century, they need look no further than the example of Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, or Reggie as he was known to friends and family. Reggie was a son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and therefore the great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch of the dynasty. He was born in 1880, and, like all members of the Vanderbilt family at the time, wanted for nothing. Unlike his father, uncles and other ancestors, this did not inspire in him a desire to maintain the family business and ensure that it prospered. Reggie headed to Yale University. Contrary to popular belief, he did actually finish some of his studies there, but he tried to continue studying for several degrees, not all of which he completed. His life became quite dissolute in the 1900s when he was in his 20s. He acquired a fondness for alcohol and gambling, a dangerous combination for a man with lots of money. This was hardly out of the ordinary for the family at the same time. Horse racing was a well-established part of the family business by then. It was just that Reggie bet on it rather than running the actual races. He inherited millions of dollars from his father, in part because another brother was disinherited, and a third, Alfred, died in the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915 during the First World War. By then, Reggie was an alcoholic with a very troubled personal life. He married twice and either gambled away his money or lost it through poor investments and his marital woes. He died on the 4th of September 1925 at only 45 years of age from cirrhosis of the liver caused by his alcoholism. By then, he had squandered millions of dollars that he had inherited, the equivalent of several $100 million in today's money, although there were several million set aside for his two daughters. It wasn't simply that the Vanderbilt wealth was being diluted as it passed to dozens of descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt, or that many of these were figures like Reggie who squandered vast amounts of money. The stark reality was that the American economy and business world was changing, and those who ran the Vanderbilt business empire were failing to innovate in the way which the Commodore had so successfully done over so many decades. A lot of the family business was still connected to the railway industry in the early 20th century. This was fine, so long as rail remained the primary means of transporting people and goods across the country. Unfortunately for the Vanderbilts, it didn't. In 1908, Henry Ford's Model T car was launched. The automobile revolution, which it was a core part of, transformed travel. When the Commodore died in 1877, if you wanted to travel from New York to somewhere like Cleveland or Chicago, you did so on a train. perhaps using a horse and carriage to get to and from the rail stations. A half a century later, such journeys were more often than not undertaken in personal automobiles. Air travel was developing too, and as it did, more and more goods and passengers were transported by air as the century went on. In terms of freight, the real challenger was the development of large freight trucks from the 1920s onwards. As these entered widespread use, trains declined as a means of transporting commodities across America. Now, instead of sending goods to a train station and then having their customers collect it from another train station, businesses could ship their goods door to door on the back of a truck. All of this dealt a huge blow to the Vanderbilt empire with its huge reliance on investment in the rail industry, though this is not to say that the family's businesses collapsed or anything like it. They simply began to decline incrementally. All of this manifested in tangible ways. Some members of the sprawling Vanderbilt dynasty inherited shares in the railway business. These, however, were nowhere near as large as the kind of enormous inheritances that the Commodore's children and grandchildren had inherited. In the aftermath of the First World War and in the decades that followed, many great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of the patriarch of the family were inheriting chunks which they decided to sell in order to have cash to spend. And as this happened, the income from the businesses began to decline. The compound impact of this and the advent of new forms of transport was the broad collapse of the Vanderbilt wealth in the middle of the 20th century. The New York Central Railway, the jewel in Cornelius Vanderbilt's rail empire, went from being the second most important railway line in the country to declaring bankruptcy in 1970. By then, extended members of the Vanderbilt clan were being told by their parents that the trust funds previous generations of the family had once lived off were a thing of the past. The decline of the family's wealth was perhaps best symbolized by the fate of the grand Vanderbilt houses. Though several of these remain in the ownership of distant ancestors of the Commodore, many of them were sold in the 20th century. Others were torn down, most notably the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion in New York. By the 1920s, as Manhattan real estate values skyrocketed and skyscrapers sprang up all over the city, Cornelius's successors couldn't justify keeping the building as it was. It was sold in 1926 and was demolished. In its place, the Bergdorf Goodman Building, a department store, was built there, although ironically it was the same height as the Vanderbilt mansion for the most part, with parts of the building only rising to 6 stories as well. By 1947, all of the major Vanderbilt townhouses in New York had been torn down. Their wealth might have been declining sharply in the 20th century, yet there were still members of the Vanderbilt dynasty who graced the pages of national newspapers and exhibited their own shrewd sense of business acumen. Gloria Vanderbilt was the most striking example. She was the daughter of Reggie Vanderbilt from his second marriage. Gloria was born in February 1924, a year and a half before Reggie died. Although he had managed to squander a huge proportion of the money he inherited, there remained several $1 million of a trust fund that was split between Gloria and her older half-sister Kathleen. Kathleen was a young woman in her early 20s when their father died. However, as she was still an infant when Reggie died, Gloria's inheritance and how it would be managed until she came of age became an issue. Gloria's mother and her aunt on her father's side both sought custody of Gloria. The management of the millions of dollars left to Gloria and her custody descended into a very public and extended legal dispute, which ended up in the courts in the 1930s. To her credit, Gloria rose above the circus that her mother and aunt had created when she was a child and went on to have success as an artist, writer, and actress. She made her biggest mark in the fashion world, and her clothing brand, particularly the line of jeans that were sold for women, made hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1970s and 1980s. In her own way, she was the most independently successful businessperson within the Vanderbilt family since Cornelius's time. While his son and grandsons had run the family business well and generated huge amounts of money, they were broadly managing existing businesses that the Commodore had built. Gloria actually created something from scratch, although clearly inheriting a sizable fortune in her youth would have helped. We do not hear much about the Vanderbilts today. This does not mean that the family has gone away entirely. Rather, the situation is that many of the more recent lines of the family consisted of more daughters than sons. As those women married and took their husbands' surnames in the 20th century, the Vanderbilt surname became less common. Nevertheless, there are many ancestors of the Commodore out there, and many of them are well known. From among these, the most famous is the CNN presenter Anderson Cooper. Cooper is a son of Gloria Vanderbilt from her fourth marriage to Wyatt Emery Cooper, a writer and actor whom she married in 1963. Therefore, Cooper is the grandson of Reggie Vanderbilt, the great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and great-great-grandson of William Henry Vanderbilt, and the great-great-great-grandson of the Commodore. The actor Timothy Olyphant, who starred in the television series Deadwood and Justified, is a great-great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. The present Duke of Marlborough in the British peerage, Charles James Spencer Churchill, the 12th Duke, is the great-grandson of Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married the 9th Duke back at the end of the 19th century. Heidi Vanderbilt, who died in 2021, was a notable actress. James Vanderbilt is a screenwriter who wrote the script for David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac. Both John Henry Hammond and his son, John Paul Hammond, had notable careers as musicians. John Henry, for instance, worked with Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Aretha Franklin, and many others in the 1950s and 1960s. He was the grandson of Emily Vanderbilt Sloan, the great patroness of New York's hospitals, and thus the great-great-grandson of the Commodore. The picture is clear. The Vanderbilts have played prominent roles in American life since the middle of the 20th century, though often carrying different surnames as a result of marriages over the generations, and generally in the cultural world rather than in business. Writing in Cornelius Vanderbilt's own day, the American author and essayist Nathaniel Hawthorne stated, "Families are always rising and falling in America." There actually wasn't much evidence for it at the time. But if Hawthorne had been writing a century later, he couldn't have picked a more apt example than the Vanderbilt family. Their story was an obscure one for well over a century, that of a very modest family of Dutch settlers to what was originally New Amsterdam and later became New York. It was only with Cornelius Vanderbilt in the early 19th century that their story really began. A hard-working and intelligent individual, he rose up through the ferrying business around Manhattan and the Hudson River in the 1810s and made his first fortune during the steamship revolution that followed from the 1820s onwards. In the 1850s, he diversified as the American West opened up and efforts began in earnest to lay down tens of thousands of kilometers of railway lines connecting the country. By the time he died in 1877, the Vanderbilts had become the dominant force in the American railway sector. His son and grandsons continued his work, becoming monopolists in the railway sector in the same vein as J.D. Rockefeller's dominance of the burgeoning oil industry. However, the family's wealth and power ultimately declined just as quickly as it had been created in the first half of the 20th century. There was a multiplicity of reasons for this. On one level, the family's wealth simply became thinly spread over multiple generations of large families. Over time, this meant the family estate was divided up between dozens of individuals. But there were other factors. Some of the foremost heirs who inherited large parts of the Vanderbilt empire squandered it on gambling and carousing. Others spent it too, though on infinitely more noble enterprises that included the foundation of several of America's greatest educational, cultural, and medical institutions. And finally, the market simply changed. Cornelius Vanderbilt caught the economic zeitgeist of his times twice, when he profited first from the advent of the steamships and then moved over to the railways. Ultimately, none of his descendants were as successful in realizing that the family business should move aggressively into the transport industries of the 20th century, namely automobiles and trucks, and later oil-powered freight ships and airlines. By the 1920s, the family were falling out of relevance in a way that was symbolized in the tearing down of the Vanderbilt mansion in Manhattan in 1926, while the stories of women like Consuelo and Gloria Vanderbilt, their unhappy childhoods and marriages, demonstrated the pitfalls of wealth. For all these reasons, while there might continue to be Vanderbilts who play an important role in American life today, the family ultimately rose and fell quite quickly in relative historical terms. What do you think of the Vanderbilts? Do you think the family's rapid rise and fall is an example of how great wealth can corrupt over several generations, which in this case led to a frivolous loss of money? Or was it simply the case that the Vanderbilts split up their wealth so much that it became diluted, whilst also using it for noble philanthropic endeavours? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.